AITA for refusing to pay my dad's debt after he cut me off for years? I never thought I'd hear from my father again. For most of my life, he was nothing more than a distant memory, a man who walked away when I was a kid and never looked back. No birthday calls, no visits, no effort, just radio silence. I used to wonder about him when I was younger, where he was, what kind of life he was living, if he ever thought about me, if he ever told people about me. I'd see other kids with their fathers at school events, at soccer games, holding their hands on the way home, and I would tell myself that maybe my dad would show up someday too. But he never did. At first, my mother tried to soften the truth. She told me that he was going through things, and that sometimes grown-ups needed time to figure things out. But as I got older, I started seeing the situation for what it was. He wasn't coming back. There was no figuring things out. He had moved on, and I wasn't part of his new life. My mother, on the other hand, never moved on from being my mom. She worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over our heads, stretched every dollar as far as it could go, and sacrificed her own needs just to make sure I had what I needed. She was the one who sat up with me at night when I had a fever, the one who taught me how to drive, how to tie a tie for school events, how to face the world even when it felt like it was against me. And my dad? He was just a name on my birth certificate. I used to try reaching out to him when I was younger. I think I held on to some childish hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd realize what he was missing, that if I called him enough times, he'd want to see me. But every time I called, he was too busy. Every time I asked if we could meet up, there was an excuse. Eventually, I stopped asking. I stopped waiting. Because there's only so many times you can try before you get the message. He didn't want to be in my life. So I let him go. Years passed, and I moved on. I built my own life. I worked hard, pushed through college, and carved out my own success, creating the kind of stability I never had growing up. I never asked anyone for help. Not my mother, not my absent father, not anyone. Everything I had, I earned. I had long since accepted that my father was nothing more than a ghost from my past. I never expected to hear from him again. Then, out of nowhere, he reached out. Not to reconnect. Not to apologize. Not because he had some great realization about what he had missed out on. He reached out because he needed money. When I first saw his name pop up on my phone, I thought it had to be a mistake. For a second, I just stared at it, my mind scrambling to make sense of why, after all these years, my father was suddenly reaching out. A part of me hesitated before answering. What if he was sick? What if something had happened? But another part of me, the part that had been let down too many times before, whispered that this wasn't a call I wanted to take. Against my better judgment, I picked up. His voice was exactly the same. Deep, casual, almost too relaxed for someone speaking to their child for the first time in years. He started with small talk, as if we were just two acquaintances catching up instead of a father and son who barely knew each other. No acknowledgement of the years of silence. No, I'm sorry. No, I should have reached out sooner. Just meaningless words that felt like an obligation, like he was going through the motions of pretending to care. And then, just as I was beginning to wonder what this was all about, he got to the real reason for the call. Listen, son, I need a little help. Just like that, it all made sense. I felt my chest tighten, my grip on the phone turning white-knuckled. So this was why he was calling. Not because he missed me. Not because he regretted leaving. Not because he wanted to make things right. Because he needed money. He started explaining in vague terms how things hadn't been easy for him, how he had fallen on hard times. I let him talk, saying nothing, listening to him paint himself as the victim of bad luck and unfair circumstances. He didn't tell me the full details at first, but I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice, the practiced way he made himself sound just pitiful enough to pull on my sympathy. Then he dropped the bombshell. He was in debt. Not just a little debt. A lot of it. Thousands upon thousands of dollars. Money he owed to people who weren't exactly forgiving. And he needed my help. I didn't respond right away. Because, honestly, I was stunned. This man, who had abandoned me, ignored me, never once tried to be a father to me, was now asking for my help? As if he had any right to? As if I owed him anything? And the worst part? He actually seemed to think I would say yes. When I finally spoke, my voice was colder than I had ever heard it. Why would I help you? The shift in his tone was instant. Gone was the casual friendliness, the forced warmth. Now he was offended. I'm still your father, he said, like that meant something. Like that word alone should be enough to erase years of absence and neglect. I let out a dry laugh. Funny, you sure didn't act like one. That's when the guilt tripping started. He told me I was being unfair, that he had his reasons for leaving, that I didn't understand how hard things had been for him. That family is supposed to help each other. Family. That word coming from him almost made me sick. I reminded him that family doesn't abandon each other. Family doesn't walk away and only come back when they need something. Family doesn't disappear for years and then suddenly expect a free pass when it's convenient for them. But he wasn't hearing any of it. Instead, he switched tactics, anger. He told me I was selfish, that after all the success I had built for myself, I couldn't even help my own father, that if the roles were reversed, he wouldn't hesitate to help me. And that's when I really lost it. The roles would never be reversed, I snapped, because I would never abandon my own child and then come crawling back years later, expecting them to bail me out. Silence. For the first time in the entire conversation, he had nothing to say. But before I could hang up, he threw out one last shot, one last attempt to manipulate me. Your mother would have wanted you to help me. I went cold. Because dragging my mother into this? That was the final straw. The second he mentioned my mother, something inside me hardened. I had been trying, really trying, to keep my emotions in check, to not let my anger completely take over. But dragging her into this? That was the final straw. My mother, the woman who had spent years struggling to make up for his absence, the woman who sacrificed everything for me, was the only real parent I had ever known. He had no right to speak her name, no right to pretend he understood what she would have wanted. I shut down. Everything he had set up until this point had been a mix of guilt tripping and manipulation, but this was different. This was desperation. He had played his last card, and when it didn't work, the mask finally dropped. His voice grew sharp, the feigned warmth and politeness vanishing. Now he was angry. He acted like I was the cruel one, like I was letting him suffer, watching him drown when I had the means to save him, as if I was turning my back on him, not the other way around. It was almost laughable. He had left me behind years ago, and yet, somehow, I was the bad guy for refusing to clean up the mess he had made of his life. The weight in my chest, the guilt I had been fighting against, disappeared. I had spent years wondering if I was missing out on something, if I was broken because I didn't feel that same deep longing for a father figure that so many others seemed to have. But in that moment, I realized there was nothing missing at all. He had already proven, over and over, that he was never meant to be in my life. I told him no. I didn't sugarcoat it, didn't offer him sympathy, didn't try to explain myself. I simply ended the conversation and hung up. And just like that, he was gone from my life again. But this time, he didn't stay gone. A few days later, the messages started. Not from him, from other family members. People who had barely spoken to me before, suddenly reaching out with judgment disguised as concern. They told me I was being heartless. That family is family, no matter what. That it wasn't about the past, it was about the fact that he needed help now. They made it sound so simple. But it wasn't simple. It never had been. If he had come back years ago, if he had made an effort to repair the damage, if he had shown any remorse for the way he had abandoned me, maybe I would have felt differently. But he hadn't. He didn't care about me. He cared about what I could do for him. I let the messages pile up. I didn't respond. Let them talk. Let them judge. Because at the end of the day, I knew who had really been there for me. And it sure as hell wasn't him.